courtroom felt silent as the words left her mouth. He told me if I ever tried to leave him, he would bury me where nobody would find me. He said it was the same thing he told his wife. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A federal marshal standing near the wall shifted his weight, just slightly, the way men do when they sense danger even inside a room built entirely on rules and order. Michael Rossi sat at the defense table like a man who had already been shot and hadn't realized it yet. His hands were flat on the wood. His face hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes had gone very, very still. This is not one of those soft stories. This is not a fairy tale about heartbreak with a neat little bow tied around it. This is what happens when a man who spent 30 years making other people disappear from conversations finally sits in a room where he cannot control what gets said out loud. This is a story about power, about the lie men like Michael Rossi tell themselves, that loyalty can be bought, that fear is close enough to love, that a woman who is scared of you will always protect you. He was wrong. And by the time this story is over, you'll understand exactly how wrong and exactly how far that mistake reached. His lawyer, Frank Delgado, turned his head slowly toward the witness stand, toward the woman standing there in a plain black dress, her hands trembling at her sides. She wasn't supposed to say that. Nobody in that courtroom, except her, except one other person sitting quietly near the back who nobody had bothered to notice yet, knew that sentence was coming. Diane Rossi, seated across the aisle in gray, didn't smile, didn't cry. She simply looked down at her folded hands and exhaled, long and slow, like a woman setting down something heavy she had been carrying for 11 years. Rewind 8 months. Before the subpoena. Before the wire recording nobody knew existed yet. Before Michael Rossi ever believed a man like him could lose. You think I'm scared of her lawyer? Michael said, laughing into a glass of scotch that cost more than most men's monthly rent. Frank, I've had judges eating out of my hand since before that woman even understood what a subpoena was. Frank didn't laugh with him. Frank had spent 22 years around men exactly like Michael Rossi, and in 22 years he had learned one hard truth. The men who laughed the loudest before a trial were usually the ones who came apart the fastest once it started. I'm not worried about the judge, Frank said. I'm worried about Vanessa. Michael waved his hand like he was swatting away a mosquito. Vanessa is not a problem. Vanessa does what I built her to do. That's the whole point of a woman like that. She's mine. She'll say whatever keeps her comfortable, and she'll say it with a straight face, because she knows exactly what happens to people who stop being useful to me. Frank sat back and rubbed his eyes. She's not a soldier, Michael. She's not one of your guys at the yard who owes you a favor and keeps his mouth shut for it. She's a person. And Rachel Simmons doesn't put a witness on a stand unless she already knows exactly what that witness is going to say. Then she doesn't know Vanessa, Michael said, and finished his drink in one long pull. To understand how a man like Michael Rossi ended up destroyed by his own mistress in a courtroom, you have to understand who Michael Rossi actually was. Not the man in the tailored suits shaking hands at charity dinners, but the man underneath the suit. Rossi Brothers Group poured concrete and hauled waste across 3 states, and on paper, that was the whole story. Off paper, everybody who mattered in Chicago knew the Rossi name carried weight that had nothing to do with construction permits. Nobody said the word mafia out loud around him. Nobody had to. Men who crossed Michael Rossi in business had a way of quietly losing their contracts, their contacts, sometimes their nerve entirely, and once, years ago, in a story nobody repeated above a whisper, their life. He had built his entire existence on one simple principle. Control everything and everyone before they get the chance to control you. He met Vanessa Cole 4 years earlier at a rooftop restaurant along the Chicago River. She was 26, a waitress from a small town in Ohio, working nights to save money for a design career she never quite got around to starting. Michael was 51, dangerous, magnetic, and used to getting exactly what he wanted the moment he decided he wanted it. A woman with a face like yours shouldn't be carrying other people's dirty plates, he told her that first night. She laughed, mostly out of nerves. It pays the bills, Mr. Rossi. Call me Michael. And it doesn't have to. Not anymore if you don't want it to. That was the hook. Small gifts became an apartment. The apartment became a car. The car became a life Vanessa had never imagined for herself. First-class flights, dinners with men who spoke in whispers and never wrote anything down, a world that felt like power right up until the day it started to feel like a cage with very expensive furniture. Back home, in the Rossi house in Lake Forest, Diane had noticed the change in her husband long before she had proof. You're not even trying to hide the cologne anymore, she said one evening, standing in the bedroom doorway. Diane, don't start. I'm not starting anything, Michael. I'm finishing something I've been finishing in my head for 2 years. He turned slowly, buttoning his cuffs, unbothered, the way he handled everything. You have a good life. A house most people would kill for. A name that makes rooms go quiet when you walk in. Whatever you think you know, ask yourself if it's worth losing all that. That's not a denial, Diane said quietly. It's not a confession either. What Michael did not know, what nobody in that house knew that night, was that Diane had already stopped being the woman he thought he married. Somewhere in the last 2 years, quietly, without a single dramatic scene, she had started building something. Not out of heartbreak. Out of 18 years of swallowed silence, finally turning into something colder and far more useful. She hired a private investigator named Sam Whitfield, a careful, quiet man recommended to her through a friend of a friend who refused to say exactly how she knew him. Diane didn't ask too many questions at first. She should have, because Sam Whitfield was not just any investigator. Mrs. Rossi, Sam told her at their first meeting, sitting across from her in a diner 2 towns away from Lake Forest. Before we go any further, there's something you should know about me. I used to work for your husband's organization. Not construction. The other side of it. I left 11 years ago, after I watched them do something to a man that I have never been able to forget. I've spent the years since then trying to balance a scale that doesn't balance easy. If you hire me, understand I am not neutral. I have my own reasons for wanting this done right. Diane sat with that for a long moment. Does that make you dangerous to me? No, Sam said. It makes me thorough. And it means I know exactly how careful we have to be, because I know exactly what your husband is capable of when he feels cornered. Over the following year, Sam built a file thick enough to end careers, and in this case, possibly end a lot more than that. Photographs of Michael and Vanessa outside a condo Michael claimed was company property. Transfers to a shell company Vanessa had no legal connection to. Records of a safety deposit box under a name Diane had never heard before. It wasn't just an affair, it was a second life, hidden brick by brick, funded quietly while Diane raised their children and smiled through his business dinners like a woman with nothing on her mind but table settings. But Sam found something else too, something he almost didn't tell Diane, because he wasn't sure how she'd take it. There's a federal task force, he told her one night, laying a folder on her kitchen table after the children were asleep. They've been building a racketeering case against your husband's operation for almost 3 years. Wire fraud, extortion, a few things I won't put into words in your kitchen. They don't have enough yet. But your husband keeps everything about his money close to Vanessa. If she ever turned, or if we could turn her, it wouldn't just help your divorce, Mrs. Rossi. It could hand them exactly what they've been missing. Diane looked at the folder for a long time before she spoke. You're asking if I want to end my marriage, or if I want to end him. I'm asking if you're ready for both to happen at the same time, Sam said. Because once this starts, there's no version where it stays small. Diane closed the folder. Then let's not keep it small. When Diane finally filed for divorce, she went straight to Rachel Simmons, a divorce attorney known across Chicago for one reputation above all others. She never lost a fight she believed in, and she never took a fight she didn't. What almost nobody in that first meeting knew was that Rachel had already been contacted, quietly weeks earlier, by an assistant U.S. attorney named Grace Alden, who had one simple question for her. If this divorce case ever put someone close to Michael Rossi on a witness stand under oath, would Rachel be willing to let the federal government know what came out of it? Rachel said yes before Grace Alden even finished the sentence. Your husband has hidden a serious amount of money, Rachel told Diane, flipping through Sam's file, her eyes narrowing with every page. Shell companies, offshore accounts, property under names that lead nowhere. Men like this always think they're smarter than the system that's about to catch them. Can we prove it? Diane asked. Rachel closed the folder. We need someone on the inside. Someone who was standing right next to him when the money moved. Diane understood exactly who Rachel meant. The mistress. The mistress, Rachel confirmed. Men like your husband think loyalty is something you buy, and it stays bought forever. They forget, anything bought can be bought away. And anything built on fear can be broken by it too if you find the right crack. Getting close to Vanessa took months. She was guarded, trained by years at Michael's side to say nothing to strangers who asked questions. What Rachel's investigators found troubled them more than they expected. Neighbors described a woman who barely left her building without a driver watching her every move. A former friend, speaking only on condition of anonymity, said Vanessa had grown distant and afraid over the past year. Afraid in a way that had nothing to do with the affair itself. She's not just his mistress, Rachel told Diane. I think she's a woman being controlled by a dangerous man. And frightened people don't respond to money. They respond to safety. It took 3 careful, secret meetings before Vanessa agreed to sit down with Rachel at all, in a hotel 2 counties away from Chicago, far from anyone who might recognize either of them. I don't know why I'm here, Vanessa said, perched stiffly on the edge of a chair, both hands wrapped around a coffee cup she never drank from. You're here because I think you know things that could change your entire life, Rachel said. Not just his. Yours. Vanessa let out a short, hollow laugh. You think I'm going to testify against Michael Rossi? Do you have any idea who he really is? I know exactly who he is, Rachel said. That's why I'm not asking you to do this for Diane. I'm asking if you're ready to do it for yourself. Silence stretched between them. Vanessa's eyes kept flicking to the door, as if some part of her still expected Michael to walk through it, even though he had no idea this meeting was happening. He told me once, Vanessa said finally, her voice dropping to barely a whisper, that women who leave him don't really leave. They just stop being talked about. He said it like a joke. I've heard how he talks about the men who cross him in business, Ms. Simmons. I don't think it was ever a joke. Has he ever threatened you directly? Rachel asked, keeping her voice level even as her pulse picked up. For the first time, the confident mask cracked completely. 3 weeks ago I told him I wanted to visit my mother back in Ohio. He grabbed my arm, so hard I had bruises for a week. He told me nobody leaves him. He told me to ask his wife how well that plan usually works out. Rachel didn't flinch outwardly. Inside, she knew she had just found the center of the entire case. What she did not yet know was how much worse it was about to get. 2 weeks before the trial date, Vanessa left her apartment building to walk to her car in an underground garage on Michigan Avenue, and a man she had never seen before stepped out from behind a concrete column and blocked her path. He was tall, quiet-voiced, wearing a jacket too heavy for the weather. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. Michael wanted me to remind you, the man said, that people who talk to lawyers sometimes end up regretting it in ways that follow them for a long time. He also wanted me to say he still loves you very much. Those 2 things aren't in conflict, in case you're wondering. Vanessa's hands were shaking so badly, she almost couldn't get her key into the car door. What the man didn't know, what nobody watching that garage that night could have guessed, was that Rachel Simmons, working now in close coordination with the federal prosecutor's office, had grown worried enough about Vanessa's safety 2 weeks earlier to arrange something Vanessa had agreed to without telling a single other soul, not even her own mother. She was wearing a wire. Every word the man said that night was recorded, time-stamped, and sitting in an evidence file by morning. When Frank Delgado learned about it 3 days later, not from Michael, but from a source inside the federal prosecutor's office who owed him an old favor and was quietly trying to warn him how deep this was about to go. He sat alone in his office for a long time before picking up the phone. Michael, Frank said, tell me you didn't send someone to talk to Vanessa. There was a pause on the other end just a beat too long. I don't know what you're talking about. Michael. She needed a reminder about loyalty. That's all. Nothing happened to her. Frank closed his eyes. Nothing happened to her, except now there might be a recording of it. Do you understand what witness intimidation does to a case, Michael? Do you understand what it does to a man already sitting under a federal magnifying glass? For the first time in the years Frank had worked for him, Michael Rossi didn't have a smooth answer ready. The morning of the hearing, Michael wore his best Navy suit and shook hands with his legal team like a man walking into a meeting he'd already won. Though something in his handshake that morning was a fraction too tight, a fraction too fast. Diane sat across the aisle, pale but steady, Rachel beside her with a folder too thick to carry in one hand, and beside Rachel, quietly, sat a woman in a plain blazer that most people in the gallery assumed was another paralegal. She was not a paralegal. Her name was Grace Alden, and she worked for the Department of Justice. The financial testimony moved fast at first, accountants, forensic auditors, dry numbers that made half the courtroom's eyes glaze over. Then Rachel Simmons stood up and said the words that made Michael sit up straight in his chair. Your Honor, the petitioner calls Vanessa Cole to the stand. Vanessa walked in wearing that same plain black dress, no jewelry, hair pulled back tightly. She didn't look at Michael as she passed the defense table, though he watched her the entire way, still smiling, still certain, right up until the second everything changed. Ms. Cole, Rachel began once Vanessa was sworn in. "Can you describe your relationship with Michael Rossi?" "I was his mistress for almost 4 years," Vanessa said, her voice shaking but clear enough to reach every corner of the courtroom. "During that time, did Mr. Rossi ever discuss his finances with you?" "All the time." "Tell the court about the property on Lakeshore Drive." Vanessa took a breath. "It's registered to a company called Belmont Holdings. Michael told me himself Belmont doesn't run any real business. It exists to hold property and move money quietly, so nothing shows up under his name. He put the condo there, so it wouldn't count as marital property if Diane ever found out and left him." A low murmur moved through the room. Michael's smile was gone completely now. Frank's hand landed lightly on his arm, a silent order to stay still. "Any other accounts, Ms. Cole?" "Other companies. There's one in the Cayman Islands he calls the safety net. He moved almost $4 million into it over 2 years. He told me, word for word, that no judge in Illinois would ever lay eyes on it." Rachel let that sentence sit in the air for a long moment before she continued. Diane sat perfectly still, watching the man she had married for 18 years come apart in front of a room full of strangers. "Ms. Cole, I want to ask you something now that has nothing to do with money," Rachel said, her tone shifting quieter, harder. "I want to ask about your safety." Frank was on his feet instantly. "Objection, Your Honor." "Relevance." "I'll allow it," the judge said flatly. "It speaks to credibility and pattern of behavior relevant to this case." Rachel nodded once and turned back to the stand. "Has Mr. Rossi ever threatened you?" Vanessa's eyes flicked, just for a second, to Michael. He was staring back at her with an expression she had never once seen on his face in 4 years. Not anger yet. "Fear." "Yes," she said. 3 weeks ago, I told him I wanted to visit my mother. He grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises. He told me nobody leaves him. He told me to go ask his wife how well that plan usually works out for people." That sentence cracked the room wide open. Diane had been warned it might come up. Nothing could have fully prepared her to hear it spoken out loud, in public, about her own marriage, her own life. Still, she felt the cold run straight through her. Michael was on his feet. "That is a lie." "Mr. Rossi, sit down," the judge snapped, the gavel cracking once against the bench. Frank hauled his client back into his chair, hissing something urgent into his ear. But the words were already sitting in the record now, already sitting in the mind of every person in that courtroom. Before we go further into how deep this actually gets, if this story has your attention, this is the moment to hit subscribe, tap that like button, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is right now on your end. This channel is where these stories live. Stick around, because the worst of it is still ahead. Rachel let the room settle before she moved to her final question on the subject. "Ms. Cole, I want to show you something and ask you to identify it for the court." She nodded to her assistant, who handed a small evidence tablet to the bailiff. 2 weeks ago, on the night of the 14th, did something happen to you in a parking garage on Michigan Avenue? Vanessa nodded, her voice barely holding. "Yes. A man stopped me. He said Michael sent him. He told me people who talk to lawyers regret it. He said Michael still loved me, like that made it better instead of worse." "And were you wearing a recording device that night, Ms. Cole?" Frank shot up again. "Your Honor, this was never disclosed in discovery." "It was disclosed to the court under seal 11 days ago, Your Honor," Rachel said calmly, "pending federal coordination, which I am now permitted to unseal." She looked toward the bench. The petitioner would like to play 30 seconds of that recording for the court. The judge considered it for a long moment, glancing toward Grace Alden in the gallery, who gave the smallest nod anyone in that room had ever given. "Proceed." The recording that played through the courtroom speakers was short, grainy, and absolutely devastating. A man's voice, low and calm, telling Vanessa exactly what Michael had told him to say. When it ended, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the court reporter's fingers stop moving on the keys. Michael's face had gone the color of chalk. Frank tried everything he had left on cross-examination, pushing Vanessa's credibility, suggesting bitterness, suggesting she was fabricating details to shield herself from her own role in hiding marital assets. But Vanessa had come prepared with more than words, more than a recording. Weeks earlier, Rachel had quietly submitted screenshots. Messages where Michael discussed moving money in plain language. Messages where his tone shifted from affectionate to controlling to outright threatening the instant Vanessa mentioned wanting space, family, or freedom. By the time Frank sat down, there was very little left of the airtight case Michael Rossi had walked into that courtroom believing he already owned. The judge called a recess. In the hallway, Michael grabbed Frank by the sleeve, every trace of composure gone, his voice a low, furious hiss. "You let her tear me apart in there. You were supposed to control this." Frank pulled his arm free, and something in his face had changed too. 22 years of swallowing things he didn't like the taste of finally reaching its limit. "Michael, I want you to listen to me very carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. I have represented you for 9 years. I have looked the other way more times than I can count, because that was the job. But you sent a man to threaten a woman in a parking garage 2 weeks before a hearing, and now there's a federal recording of it sitting in a courtroom file with my name attached to the case. I am not going to lose my license, and I am not going to lose the rest of my life, protecting a decision you made on your own. I'm withdrawing as your counsel, effective this afternoon. You'll have that in writing within the hour." Michael stared at him like the words weren't landing. "You can't do that in the middle of a hearing." "Watch me," Frank said, and walked away down the hallway without looking back. Michael stood alone for a moment, truly alone for what may have been the first time in 30 years, and it was in that silence that a woman he didn't recognize approached him, holding out a badge in a leather case. "Mr. Rossi," she said, "my name is Grace Alden, Department of Justice. I'd like a moment of your time once this hearing concludes. I think you already have some idea what it's regarding." Michael said nothing. For a man who had spent his whole life having something clever ready for every room he walked into, he suddenly had nothing at all. When the hearing resumed, the judge wasted no time making his position clear. Combined with the financial records, the recording, and Vanessa's testimony, the evidence painted a picture of deliberate, calculated concealment of marital assets, compounded by an act of witness intimidation so blatant that the judge ordered a full forensic audit of every company tied to Michael Rossi's name, referred the intimidation matter directly to federal authorities already sitting in the room, and awarded Diane a far larger share of the marital estate than anyone present, including Diane herself, had walked in expecting. What almost nobody in that courtroom understood yet, except Diane, Rachel, Sam Whitfield, and the quiet woman in the plain blazer near the back, was that the divorce had never really been the whole point. It had been the crack in the wall. Everything Sam had gathered over that year, every account number, every shell company, every conversation Vanessa had quietly remembered and repeated, had been feeding 2 cases the entire time, one in family court, and one that had been building, patiently for 3 years in a federal building 6 blocks away. Outside the courthouse, reporters who had caught wind of the explosive testimony packed the steps, cameras flashing, microphones stretching toward anyone who looked important enough to answer a question. Diane came out first, Rachel beside her, and gave the small crowd only one line before her driver opened the car door for her. "I spent 18 years being told to stay quiet for the sake of peace. Today, the truth finally got to speak instead." Michael came out several minutes later, alone now, no lawyer beside him, his face a hard, unreadable mask. The same mask he had worn into 100 business meetings where he was used to walking away the winner. A reporter shouted a question about the threats Vanessa had described on the stand. Michael stopped at the top of the steps, straightened his jacket out of pure habit, and looked toward the nearest camera with the same calm, commanding voice he had used his entire life to make people believe whatever he wanted them to believe. "I take care of everyone in my life," he said. "Always have." Behind him, 2 black sedans pulled up to the curb, and 4 agents in plain suits began climbing the courthouse steps toward him, unhurried, the way people move when they already know exactly how this ends. Michael saw them and turned to the man standing nearest him, an assistant who had driven him that morning, and said, in the same easy tone he used for everything, "Cancel my 3 o'clock. Tell them we'll reschedule." He had no idea, as he said it, just how long that reschedule was going to take.